And I'd like to just say to you guys, all of you guys, that, today is the 500th shiur of, we've done a few others, but the 500 recorded shiur. We've had a couple we forgot to record. So we did 500 a little while ago, and we did some ones on dedication that weren't part of the Gemara. But we have 500 recorded shiurim of us where you've tolerated me and been very kind to me. And I think that quote by Robert Collier is pretty good.
So I tell you, we've actually got a secret on how we actually tolerate you. We fall asleep during the shiur. That's how we do it.
I know, but as long as I can give you your solid 8 hours a night, I'm happy. So exactly. So
Dan, you got to remember, we have done more than 500, but the ones you didn't post were the ones where you're like total idiots in.
Listen, I've edited out where we both. I think that's the most humorous part. A lot of the stuff I've edited out that are not fit for YouTube consumption is probably the most hysterical parts of the shiur. But just guys, well done, because exactly as the saying goes, success is the sum of small efforts repeated day in and day out. It's not the glamorous stuff, it's the continual slog. So I appreciate it. Hashem appreciates it, and Hashem appreciates you tolerating me. So guys, thank you.
Consistency.
And teach us.
Okay, so just another few ideas about doing business with integrity. It says, one who conducts his business with integrity is promised that his possessions will be blessed. The Menorahs HaMaor explains that the blessing will derive from the trust that people place in him and their willingness to invest money in his enterprises. Apparently, this is the intent of the verse in Prohibition, which says, a good name is better than good oil. A person's good reputation will stand him in good stead, yielding even more than just good oil. And oil, which means it actually is a metaphor for material things. The words of the Chofetz Chaim highlight the seriousness of violating trust in business dealings. He was asked once by his students, why was a law that deals with the prohibition of idolatry affixed in the reading of the Shema? And this is in Devarim, lest you turn astray and worship other gods. Given that the drive for idolatry hardly exists anymore, why do we need to mention this prohibition twice a day, morning and evening? He answered, to my chagrin, almost every Jew is liable to stumble at any moment upon the severe prohibition of idolatry. If you will ask me, how can this be? I will explain to you. A person owns a supermarket and every day receives a shipment of fresh fish. Sometimes he has a fish left from the previous day. What does the average store owner do with this? He places yesterday's fish on top of the pile so it will be sold first. The fish has from yesterday is no longer fresh, and he really should sell it at a lower price. However, the storekeeper sells it as if it is fresh at the full price. This happens because the storekeeper thinks that if he will sell the fish for less, his livelihood will not be forthcoming. Okay, so I'll continue the rest tomorrow because it's like a longish paragraph. So it's obviously alluding to that it should be sold for half, but it shouldn't be sold at the same price. It's not ethical to do such things. I mean, I assume, and we will get to it tomorrow.
Okay, so Kevin, what Kevin's teaching us, the bottom line is the spirit of Bava Kamma. In other words, being like acting like a mensch towards other people and taking responsibility for negligence, damage, hurt, injury, death, as well as responsibility for products and services rendered at a fair price. So thank you very, very much. We're talking now, which we're going to get to this for quite a while. Arthur's already done this with Rabbi Cohen. But for the rest of you, we're talking about an assailant's liability for temporary injuries. So Rabbi inquired, what's the law regarding an injury that causes loss of employment and that temporarily reduces the victim in value? Is the assailant liable for temporary loss of value? So Rabbi speaks of a case where the assailant struck a blow that forced the victim to stop working. But obviously, guys, eventually the wound will heal completely. So the victim suffers a loss of employment, but no permanent damage. However, during the time of his recuperation, his value is reduced, because when he's then sold in the slave market, he would command a lower price than usual. So since most purchasers are not medical experts, they wouldn't be confident that the victim would fully recover, and they would offer less money for him. That's according to Tosfot. However, when it's obvious to all, even non-medical experts, that the injury is only a temporary one, everybody holds that there's no liability for nezek, actual damage, and the assailant pays only the loss of income. So at issue then is whether the victim's temporary loss of value is considered nezek, actual damage, for which he must be compensated. Now, it was interesting. I listened to Rabbi Cohen's share last night on this, and I've got this aversion to slavery, as you know, but it wasn't like that. We're talking about, firstly, a Jew, and there were two reasons that a Jew went into slavery. The one was indentured servitude, because he stole, committed a crime, and didn't have the money to pay back. So therefore, his services rendered would make him spiritually clean and recompensate the damaged party or the party that was stolen from in lieu of labor for something that was sentimental that they lost of the same value. So it's not meaning that a person automatically gets imprisoned for 6 years or up to the 7th for servitude if you stole something of minor value. What it means is that the sentence could be up to that period, at which case you would have the year where the servant would be set free. So we're saying it's not as if you have to do that full term, whether you steal something small or big. It just means up to. In other words, when people get a charge for rape, it could be up to X amount of years, but in terms of circumstantial evidence, that's a bit dubious. In other words, he was drunk, she was drunk, was there consent, was there not consent, what were the circumstances, were they going out before, was it a little bit of a gray area, etc. It can be up until that, and in case of a theft, it could be less if the value that was taken was less. That's number one. The second thing that was interesting is Rabbi Cohen, when I was speaking to him, he was also saying that in terms of servitude, it often happened, and I was watching everything from Downton Abbey to certain things that happened in the 17th and 18th centuries, that people would become indentured servants out of sheer poverty. So what would happen is there was a bartering system. In other words, you could starve alive, or alternatively offer your services for food and lodging. Now, what is that if not slavery? Nobody starves their slave, because your slave that doesn't eat is not a functional employee. So it was a mutual arrangement. Was it a happy arrangement? No. Nobody's really got a happy arrangement. I don't think any employee ever dreamed that they'd take orders and have to do menial work. But not everybody's life turns out exactly the way they want. Also, what happened then is you had a caste system, especially in England and many other countries, where you were born into poverty, you'd stayed in poverty, you'd die in poverty, your children and grandchildren would end up in poverty, and that's the way it was. If you were part of the lucky sperm club, you were rich, and that's how it worked. Today, people obviously want equality, and that is a good goal. And I think people like Jane Austen and other authoresses and authors had to bring up to the fact that inequality is not the ideal. But by the same token, the world is a place where there's far more in population than resources available. So you always have the 1%, the 5%, 20%, and the rest. Now, the thing of it is, a Jewish slave had very good working conditions to where he was treated as a member of the family. It wasn't like a Canaanite slave. And if you start to feel sorry for the Canaanite slave or other nations, you must know it's like going to Tehran and dealing with the Taliban. They're lucky they weren't killed. And by the way, in Rome and Greece, slavery and all sorts of things that we consider against human rights now were the only way that people could survive, by swapping work and skills in order to earn a living. So what's this temporary losses as follows, is that somebody could indenture themselves and say to them, say, I want to go in the employee market, let's call it an employee market, and I'm a tailor. And as a tailor, I would earn 15,000 Rand a month. And I would sell myself to somebody for 6 years, at which, even though I'm worth 15,000 Rand a month, my overheads are 10. Let me say I'll take 10 a month, and times 12 months is 120. And then times 5 years, that's what it is. And if you had a wealthy person, you might want a tailor every day and start a tailoring business and subcontract to you when you've paid a mass sum upfront as an employer to have the employee do the work. The other way that so that was indentured servitude, or it could be that food and lodging was exchanged, and then goods and services would either be done for the household, the farm, agrarian or agricultural sort of societies, or skill like blacksmithing. So what we're saying is, when an injury is temporary in nature, the person that is about to purchase either you or your services, depending on what society you lived at, would not know if you recover. I mean, if your hand is lame and you were a tailor, you ain't going to get employment as a tailor, because you're going to say it's going to recover. And what do you think the guy's going to say? Very nice. When you recover, come see me for a job. Until you recover, like, if you're the one stump wonder, what do you want from me? So the thing of it is, the question that arises is, do you pay for the temporary damage as though it's permanent until such time as that person comes right? Because do they ever come right? Okay, that's Rabba's question. Now, the Gemara clarifies the question, because it said, what is the case? It's where the assailant struck the victim on his hand and his hand shriveled and became disabled, but in the end it's returned to its full health. So I've never heard of a case where a hand shrivels and grows back. I think it means that there's muscle atrophy or some sort of paralysis. But what's the law in such a case? Do we say that since its end is to return to the full size and complete use of that particular function of the anatomy, that at the end of the day, the assailant doesn't give the victim anything for damage of the hand? Why? Because it's temporary in nature. In other words, the assailant doesn't pay the amount the victim's value decreased because of temporary loss of his hand, according to Rashi. He does, however, according to Rashi, compensate for loss of income and the other three categories where they're relevant, which is paid medical bills and humiliation. But in this case, there might not be humiliation, but there would certainly be what you call shevet, which is recuperation. So that's a given. So according to Rashi, it would seem that the permanent basis of the damage, nezek, wouldn't be paid, but recuperation, in other words, how many months can he not work as a tailor? So if he can't work for a tailor for 6 months, and in those 6 months he would earn 10 grand a month, well, then you would give him 60-month worth of shevet, which is recuperation, at not a cucumber watchman salary. Why? Because we discussed and alluded to this before, that either there's a big capital disability payout and a small shevet, because now as an invalid, you only pay him his recovery of what he could now do in this current position. Or if there's no permanent capital disability fee of millions of rand, you certainly pay him what he would not be able to do in his functional job for the period of time it takes him to recover, because again, it's a temporary injury. So that's the question in hand. So the Gemara responds, so that could be the case. So do we say that since its end is to return to the full size and use, the assailant doesn't give the victim anything for damage of the hand, only for the recovery time of what he would have earned potentially for those 3 or 4 months of damage or whatever, the medical bill, the pain, etc. Or perhaps now the Gemara is saying, at any rate, his value on the slave or employee market is reduced, because most people are not medical experts. If you're going to get a job as a tailor, the dressmakers will say, well, look, when your hand comes right, come get a job. And in that case, his market value is reduced as a person. So maybe the assailant should actually compensate for the loss and have nezek, and then a smaller period as though he was an invalid until he recovers. And when he recovers fully, he recovers. So the Gemara says, come then a proof from the following Mishnah. And where is it in 87a? We haven't gotten there yet, but it's bringing this forward. And it said, an assailant is liable for temporary damage. So it's bringing a case where one who strikes his father or mother and did not inflict a wound upon them, and one who wounds his fellow on Yom Kippur. So what are we talking about? Guys, if you remember Shmot chapter 21, verse 15, and in Gavin, you and I learned this in Sanhedrin, in the 84th daf, that one who strikes his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. So then there's capital punishment for that. But only the capital punishment occurs, Gavin, if the child actually inflicts a wound. But if there's no blood draw or anything like that, then what is liable is the temporary damage that's occurring. Because, so we're saying that this is not a proper wound, because if it was a proper wound, then the child, or when we say a child, we don't mean under a kotel, a minor. We're saying somebody that is an offspring of these parents, but a legal adult would get the death penalty. So obviously here there wasn't a wound, but what there could have been is damage that didn't display as a wound. So what do we do in that case? And one who wounds his fellow on Yom Kippur. So what do we mean, one who wounds his fellow on Yom Kippur? Because if you wound on Shabbat, guys, what do you think the penalty is?
Death. Exactly,
it's a capital offense. So punishment on Yom Kippur for wounding is kares. It's not fun, but it's not the death penalty. Okay, so what we're saying is here that somebody that wounds somebody on Yom Kippur, another Jew, or wounds his wounds his parents, but there's no wound that displays, all 5 categories of payment occur. Because since the assailant is not liable to capital punishment in either case or based on a technicality, he must make a monetary restitution just like any other assailant, according to the Meiri. Now, what's the case of a child that didn't inflict a wound upon his parent? In other words, how is it possible to have damage when there's no wound? Okay, so is it not a case where he struck his parent on his parent's hand and it shriveled in functionality, but in the end it returned to full health? So in that case, we're saying, is it a temporary nature which doesn't manifest as an open bleeding injury? So the Mishnah says, well, if it's saying it's temporary nature and there's no wound, then why is the assailant liable for all of the damage, including nezek, actual damage? Because therefore it's an argument that since the injury will fully heal, the damage payment must be for the parent's temporary loss of value on the employee market. So the Mishnah proves that a temporary loss is also considered nezek, as though it was permanent, until such time as it heals. When it's healed, there can be a reassessment of the situation. So although this isn't a case of temporary loss of value, and the damage is permanent, well, the damage isn't permanent, we're saying, hang on a second, there might be a slightly different case. So the Gemara is saying, well, what case could we be dealing with? So it's saying a case where a child made the parent deaf. So in other words, they actually lost their hearing, which is considered the equivalent of death. But because there was no wound upon him, the child didn't get the death penalty. Or let's call him not a child. The Gemara calls him a child. What do we call it? An adult. How would you refer to
a juvenile?
No, it's not a juvenile. That's exactly the point, because a juvenile doesn't get the death penalty. In other words, the adult who has older parents, how do you refer to the child without it making it seem like an infant or a child?
Son.
Yes, son. The son, I prefer the word the son, the adult son. Gavin's got it down pat. Okay, so the adult son basically made his parent deaf. There wasn't a wound, therefore he didn't get the death penalty. So that damage is permanent. It's not a temporary case. That's what the Gemara is asking. But Rabbi himself said one who makes his father deaf is executed. Why? Not because being deaf is equivalent to being financially dead, because you can't earn a living, but because the act of deafening to occur without a wound isn't possible, because it's an internal bleeding. In other words, in the inner eardrum, there is damage, and although it's not an external wound, it's eligible for the death penalty. So we've got to come up with a different interpretation. So we can say that maybe we should rather just talk about a shriveled hand, or a hand that is non-functional and injured, but that didn't display a wound. It just now is not of the same level of functionality. So the Gemara says, look, it's proposing a different case here. It's saying, no, you can't say that necessarily, because then it would still be considered perhaps a wound of some sort. In other words, we're saying that it's a case slightly different, where a case, the Gemara says, where a son shaved the head of his father. Now, guys, something there should be a little bit wrong with you. Okay, because if it says that the son, according to Rashi, diminished his father's value without causing a wound by shaving his father's hair, and that's why, because he didn't create a wound, there's no capital punishment and rather monetary restitution. Is shaving hair a permanent affliction?
No.
Why?
It grows back.
Exactly. So that's exactly what the Gemara is saying. It's saying, well, what are you talking about? It grows back. And anybody that saw the father with shaved hair, many careers are not done where it makes a difference if a person's got a full head of hair or bald. But let's just say he was his hair made a difference. He was a model. Exactly. Let's say it was a model where it did. All they would say is, when your hair grows back, come and see us for a job. So there'd only be what you call temporary payment of loss of income. So the Gemara is saying, no, we're explaining it a little bit different. It's where the son applied a depilatory cream. Now, I didn't know what the word depilatory means. Did you?
No.
So basically, it's a permanent hair loss cream. I think a woman use it for epilady or something to shave their legs. But there it just makes hair loss. It doesn't seem to cure the problem permanently. Although if they did cure the problem permanently, they wouldn't have a market. As I often say with medical, they never cure a disease when they can make millions and billions per month managing a disease. But that's just me being sickly and seeing the billions of potential of actually managing diseases instead of curing them. So maybe in that day they had the depilatory creams, which were permanent, but today it seems as though it's temporary nature. But the bottom line is the father humiliated the son. The father was humiliated by the son's action. So he's saying, okay, so there's no temporary loss of value here. So in that particular case, it's permanent. So if it's permanent, then you've got a problem in terms of the permanence. Why would you consider this a temporary nature? In other words, if you're discussing temporary damage, then discuss the shaved hair. And a guy's a model, and he doesn't earn, and it grows back. Or if you want to say that it's permanent hair loss, then that's permanent damage. It might not create a wound, but now you're getting off the topic of the temporary damage in nature. So just to explain, because I didn't understand what difference it made, whether the father's head was shaved off permanently, not depilatory cream, etc. So the bottom line is, it says that there's a pain because the father's scalp cracks and it's an agony. Okay? And apart from that, there's the healing. aspect. There's loss of employment because it said the father used to dance in taverns as a jester. I prefer Gavin's example as maybe he's a model, or maybe he's a showman, or something that we can relate to today, meaning that his face was his branding, and he was well recognized by it, and that obviously affected his income. But because he can't show his features now because of the pain and the cracks and the scabbing, etc., he not only is liable for humiliation, the son, but he's also liable for the loss of income. Okay, so it's saying, well, is it permanent or not? So look, the bottom line is, even though this is a question to Rava, it's obvious to a buyer and Rava. Why? But they hold in two different directions. In other words, Abaye and Rava hold by completely different views. Rava had a question in this. Abaye was quite fixed in his response, and both was Rava. So it basically, where the assailant struck the victim on his hand and it shriveled and became disabled, but in the end it's going to return to full functionality. The matter of liability is disputed as follows. Abaye said the assailant must give the victim compensation for his major loss of employment, meaning the temporary loss of value. In other words, the value of his hand, because since the victim on the slave market or on the employee market will be depressed until his hand's healed, because nobody that's hiring him is a medical expert, he's basically compensated for the temporary loss of value. Okay, so Abaye calls it nezek. And then he says at the end of the day, in addition to that, there is also compensation for the major loss of employment, which is a temporary loss of value, but also the minor loss of employment. What does he mean? The loss of income. So in other words, for both until he gets full maneuverability back. Now, I connect more with Rava's response, because Rava says the assailant gives the victim only the value of his daily loss of employment until he heals, since the nature of the injury is temporary. So Rava and Abaye argue over whether damage payment and nezek payment is required for a temporary loss of value. So, all right, guys, let me just see how much time. Yeah, we've got 2 minutes. So there was another case of personal injury discussed regarding one who cuts off the hand of his fellow Hebrew servant. The matter of liability is disputed as follows. Abaye said the assailant gives compensation for the major loss of employment, in other words, the permanent loss of value to the servant, because what's actually happening here, it's a Jewish servant, is that he must leave his master with his full value intact because he's not going to be able to work again. And then the compensation for the minor loss of employment, the loss of income to the master. Why? Because the master paid the servant to work for him. So, guys, it proves that Jewish servitude is not for free. It's not like you can buy and sell a slave on the market, as if we're imagining in America, when they bought and sold slaves. This was indentured servitude. So it said basically the master or the employer has actually paid his employee to work for him, and that loss is a loss to the business. It's a loss to the master or the household. So he must also be compensated in that particular case, as well as the person as an employee that can no longer work for anybody. So Rava said something completely different. He said that everything shall be given to the servant, and the land shall be purchased with the funds, and the master consumes the produce. So he's actually got a fair system where he says the employer gets to use the produce and reap the benefits, whereas the servant, the employee that actually got permanently disfigured, gets to keep the asset. And once the master paid back, the employee or the servant actually gets to keep the asset base. Okay, so the Gemara concludes, it's obvious that if the assailant lessened the servant's value vis-a-vis the servant himself, but did not lessen the servant's value versus his master, what's the case? So we say, listen, there could be a case where the servant just looks disfigured, but is fully functional, at which case the servant gets all the money and the master gets nothing. And that's an argument between Abaye and Rava.